All right, welcome to week 13. This week we are exploring the issue of counterterrorism, which are the proactive measures governments can undertake to remove terrorist environments and groups. Martin opens the chapter with a story of the SEAL Team 6 nighttime raid into Pakistan on May 2nd, 2011, that resulted in the killing of Osama bin Laden. In my opinion, Obama's launching of that raid went a long way towards ensuring his re-election 18 months later. And I know that's a bold statement. And I don't believe that's the only reason Obama was reelected. But my suspicion is that had the administration not prioritized successfully finding and killing bin Laden, the odds of his successful reelection would have likely dropped below 50% going into the last 12 months of 2012, and that would have really left him vulnerable. After the raid, attacking Obama as weak on terrorism became demonstrably more difficult. And we always have to remember Benghazi happened literally a month before the election. Imagine how the media would have framed that event in an environment where bin Laden was still alive, where Obama didn't have that achievement to point to. All right, so states try to take active measures to secure their homeland, break up terrorist organizations, and deter states sponsoring terrorism from attacking their interests, and generally making it more difficult for terrorists to exploit weaknesses and launch terrorist attacks on soft targets. In addition to counterterrorism, states also engage in what we call anti-terrorism, or hardening likely targets of terrorism, training law enforcement in rapid response to terrorist attacks, and other kinds of measures like working with social media to shut down terrorist websites. So, what kinds of counterterrorism measures can a state deploy? The chapter is really kind of replete with kind of a survey of the different menu of things that that governments can do to combat terrorism. Responses range from active use of military force to attack targets where they show themselves, to repressive policies like curfews, infiltration operations, and covert operations, and then to conciliatory response. The latter is often we give it short shrift, but it can have, it can be successful. During the Reagan and Bush administrations, the stated policy of the United States was America doesn't negotiate with terrorists. But we did. We negotiated the release of U.S. hostages held in Iran, and we negotiated to release hostages held in the Bekaa Valley. Israel, which probably just deploys, the most active military measures to combat terrorism, has also negotiated with terrorist organizations on numerous occasions. I think I've mentioned before, sometimes terrorist organizations represent legitimately aggrieved populations. Conciliatory policies towards those populations can often serve to drive a wedge between terrorist groups and the constituencies from which they recruit and receive funding. To illustrate, consider the career of Euskadi Ta Askatasuna. That's the Basque name for Basque homeland liberty. They organized in 1959 with the intent of protecting Basque culture from repressive Falangist policies in Spain under Francisco Franco, and were one of the more violent of the European terrorist groups operating in the 1960s and 70s. They were responsible for over 800 killings between 1968 and 2010. In December 1973, ETA successfully assassinated Admiral Luis Carrera Blanco in Madrid, and that was Franco's designated successor, and whose death really precipitated a rapid democratic transition. The democratic Spanish government's response to continued ETA terrorist activity was initially to sponsor a kind of dirty war of torture and repression against suspected ETA members by privately controlled what were known as anti-terrorist liberation groups, the acronym GAL. I think you can guess how that worked out. But as as democracy consolidated in Spain, the legal system eventually began to successfully prosecuting GAL members and leaders. You fast forward through the 1980s, and you have a series of law enforcement and counterterrorist actions combined with political conciliation towards the Basques in terms of granting Basque territories considerable autonomy. And by 2011, ETA had pretty much permanently disbanded and transitioned into political parties. My point on this case is that Silver bullets generally don't exist, okay? It requires the careful, judicious combination of law enforcement, counter, and anti-terrorist policies, and sometimes a dose of conciliation in order to kind of pull the sting out of the grievances that people use to justify terrorism. But if you think that you're going to persuade terrorists themselves that what they're doing is unjust or wrong, you're probably barking up the wrong tree. And we also have to keep in mind, and I hate saying this, but sometimes massive repression works to stop terrorism. Now it does so at the sacrifice of democracy, and we have to ask ourselves if that's a price worth paying. In terms of gradables this week, we only have the weekly form and quiz, so let's make sure we do a good job on both. Let's have a great week.